Imagine this. You're standing ankle-deep in mud and blood. The mist is curling around you like the hands of the dead. You smell iron. You hear the soft hiss of a blade being cleaned, not because the killing is over, but because it's about to begin again. You've been taken alive. The men around you wear armor lacquered black, crests glinting in the gray dawn. Samurai. The so-called paragons of honor and discipline. That's the story they've sold the world for centuries. What they don't tell you. Once you were in their hands, the rules changed. Your fate was no longer battle. It was spectacle. You could be crucified and left for the crows, stripped and boiled alive in a cauldron while the victors laughed, or given a sword and invited to slice open your own belly so they could call your death honorable. And if you were lucky enough to die quickly, they'd still take your head, polish it like a piece of art, and display it as proof of their power. Museums won't show this, school books won't teach it, but here you will see the horrific truth. Hit that like button if you're ready, because the worst is still coming. To understand the horrors you're about to hear, you have to step back into the mud, the politics, and the blood-soaked centuries of feudal Japan. This was no peaceful land of cherry blossoms and tea ceremonies. From the late Heian period in the 100s through the Sengoku and into the Edo era, Japan was a chessboard of warlords, shifting alliances, and merciless ambition. The samurai were the kingmakers and executioners of this world. Bound by Bushido, the way of the warrior, they swore loyalty to their lords unto death. But Bushido was not the pure chivalric code romanticized today. It was a weaponized morality, a set of rules that made cruelty righteous if it served loyalty, honor, or vengeance. On the battlefield, taking an enemy's life wasn't enough. You took his head, literally. Severed heads were collected, cleaned, and sometimes painted with makeup to make them presentable for inspection. The daimyo, seated in judgment, would examine each trophy, reward the killer with gold or land, and record the death as a political victory. Prisoners of war had no Geneva Convention to protect them. Crucifixion, dismemberment, and boiling alive were public punishments, not for criminals alone, but for captured samurai who defied their conquerors. Even honorable deaths like seppuku were sometimes forced, an act meant to strip a man of dignity in front of friend and foe alike. For civilians caught in the chaos, survival was a coin toss. Entire villages were enslaved, relocated, or annihilated to send messages to rival clans. And then there were the rumors, acts so brutal that even contemporary chroniclers hesitated to commit them to paper for fear of staining their lord's reputation. These were not isolated events, they were patterns, systems of fear and dominance, and over time, they became ritualized, even celebrated, by the warrior class. The Japan you think you know, the polite, restrained culture of manners, was built atop centuries of bloodletting, humiliation, and ceremonial violence. The samurai's image was scrubbed clean by later historians, romanticized in art, and sterilized for export to the West. But the truth was always there, in the war diaries, the execution grounds, and the bones buried deep under castle stones. And that truth, we're about to drag it back into the light. The battle is over. The screaming has stopped. But for the samurai, this is when the real work begins. They move across the battlefield like merchants at a grisly market, stepping over corpses, kneeling beside the fallen. Not to mourn them, to measure them. A hand on the hair, a swift slice, and another head is taken. But these trophies weren't left as they were. No, each one was prepared for presentation. Eyes closed, mouths sewn or pressed shut. In some cases, cosmetics were applied, powder to the skin, rouge to the lips, to make the dead seem more noble. The face of your enemy, once contorted in pain, now turned into an eerie mask. Then came the inspection. The heads were lined up before the victorious lord, sometimes dozens, sometimes hundreds, arranged by rank, age, or notoriety. The general would walk the line, studying the features, verifying identities. Rewards were given on the spot: gold coins, silk, or the promise of promotion. It wasn't just about proof of victory, it was humiliation turned into a public ritual. Your enemy's identity reduced to a detached, lacquered object. And for the samurai, each head was a stepping stone to glory. But if you think that's the peak of their cruelty, this is only the beginning. Picture the year 1551. The warlord Takeda Shingen, already feared across the provinces, turns his eyes toward Shika Castle. The defenders know what's coming. The siege is swift, brutal, and offers no quarter. When the gates fall, the killing isn't enough for Shingen. He orders the execution of 15 senior samurai captured alive, men of status, training, and pride. Each one is decapitated in turn. But the punishment doesn't stop there. 300 Ashigaru common foot soldiers are dragged forward, kneeling in the mud, awaiting the same fate. By the end of the day, the castle courtyard is transformed into a grotesque garden of heads. They are displayed along the outer walls for all to see, defenders, prisoners, even surviving civilians. The message is unmissable. Resist Takeda Shingen, and this is your destiny. The wind carries the stench into the surrounding countryside. Farmers, travelers, and enemy scouts see the display long before they reach the gates. Fear spreads faster than any army could march. For Shingen, this isn't savagery, it's strategy. Terror is a weapon, and he wields it as skillfully as his sword. But if you think public executions were the worst, wait until you hear what they did to captives in private. Public executions were for show. But the true depths of samurai cruelty unfolded away from the eyes of commoners, inside fortress courtyards, secluded barracks, or deep within prison compounds. Here, there was no audience to impress, only enemies to break. Crucifixion was one of their favorite tools. Not the quick, clean image you might imagine, but a prolonged agony. The condemned were bound or nailed to wooden crosses, sometimes upright, sometimes in an X shape, and left under the burning sun for days. Birds would arrive before death did. In some cases, executioners used spears to pierce the victim's sides in a slow, deliberate rhythm, prolonging the suffering while preventing a swift end. Other times, the captors preferred boiling. A massive iron cauldron, heated over hours, filled with water or oil. Prisoners were lowered in slowly, sometimes feet first, to keep them alive and screaming as long as possible. These weren't acts of rage. They were calculated demonstrations of dominance, carried out to send a message to the next prisoner. Your fate is not death. Your fate is our entertainment. And yet, for high-ranking enemies, there was something even more twisted, forcing them to kill themselves for the sake of honor. That comes next. For the common prisoner, death could be crude and messy. But for a captured samurai of high rank, there was a far more calculated humiliation, forced seppuku. It was dressed up as an honorable way out. The victor would offer a defeated enemy a small, razor-sharp blade or a short sword, and sometimes, in a final insult, only a wooden fan. The message was clear. You will not die by our hand. You will destroy yourself in front of us. The ceremony was staged to strip away dignity. The prisoner was dressed in white, seated on a tatami mat before witnesses. A kaishakunin, an appointed second, stood by with a long sword, ready to deliver the decapitating blow once the ritual was complete. But this was no mercy. The blade would not fall until the prisoner had plunged the dagger into his own belly and drawn it across in a slow, agonizing cut. Some kaishakunin intentionally delayed their strike, letting the condemned suffer longer. Others used a dull blade, turning the final moment into a grotesque struggle. To the samurai code, it was an ending of honor. To the man kneeling on the mat, it was just another execution, one that made him complicit in his own destruction. Sometimes, forced seppuku wasn't just about one man's death. It was about erasing an entire bloodline in a single, controlled spectacle. After a decisive victory, a warlord might summon every surviving commander of the defeated clan into a grand hall. Tatami mats would be laid out in perfect symmetry, incense burned to mask the stench of fear. One by one, the prisoners were called forward, handed a blade, and told to fulfill their duty. The victors sat in silence, watching as each man knelt, cut his belly, and waited for the kaishakunin's strike. The silence was only broken by the soft thud of heads falling into wicker baskets, carried away by attendants as if they were precious offerings. By the end of the night, the enemy clan's chain of command had been decapitated, literally and figuratively. With their leaders dead, their lands and soldiers fell easily under the victor's control. This was political theater at its most chilling. No screams, no chaos. just a quiet, systematic purge masked as a ritual of honor. And for those who still refused to submit, there was an even more lawless form of cruelty: random slaughter in the streets, carried out in the name of training. If battlefields and execution grounds weren't enough, there was a darker practice that blurred the line between warfare and murder: Sujigiri, the crossroads killing. When a samurai forged or acquired a new katana, it was said the blade needed to be tested. And what better test than human flesh? Late at night, a lone samurai might roam a quiet road, waiting for an unsuspecting traveler, often a farmer, a merchant, or a wandering monk. With no warning, the sword flashed once. The victim never had time to scream. Sometimes the strike was meant to kill instantly. Other times, it was done to observe how the blade cut through different parts of the body, testing its sharpness on necks, torsos, or limbs. These acts weren't sanctioned warfare. They were personal experiments. The victims were random. The violence was meaningless except to the killer and his sword. Eventually, Sujigiri became so notorious that in 1602 it was banned outright. But a ban was just a law on paper. Out in the countryside, away from the watchful eyes of the shogunate, the killings continued. For civilians in feudal Japan, danger wasn't just in war. It could appear in the shape of a smiling warrior on a moonlit road. When samurai armies swept through the countryside, the clash on the battlefield was only the first wave of destruction. The real devastation came afterward, when entire villages were swallowed whole. If a settlement had aided the enemy, even with food or shelter, its fate was sealed. Men were bound in ropes, marched off as labor slaves or conscripts. Women and girls could be taken for servitude, a polite word for a grim reality. Many never saw their families again. Children were sometimes kept alive to be raised as servants in enemy households, stripped of their identity and name. Houses were looted and burned. Rice stores were emptied. Tools, livestock, even the wooden beams of homes were carried off as spoils. For the victors, this wasn't theft, it was strategy. A destroyed village couldn't support rebels, couldn't hide fugitives, couldn't rise again. Some warlords treated these acts as casual policy, recording them in campaign logs without a hint of shame. Others ordered massacres to send a message, wiping entire communities off the map. And for those who survived, there was still no safety, because their captors had more uses for them than just labor. The next step was even colder. For the samurai, a living prisoner was more than just a body. It was a message, a weapon of psychological warfare. High-ranking captives might be paraded through the streets in chains, forced to kneel before jeering crowds. Their hair would be hacked short, a sign of disgrace, while banners announcing their crimes were hung from their necks. In some cases, they were gagged with wooden bits, not to silence them from pleading, but to make them appear like dangerous animals being restrained. Commoner prisoners faced even harsher theatrics. Some were tied to posts at the edge of a marketplace and beaten publicly before their execution. Others were forced to dig their own graves while the crowd looked on. Children were sometimes made to watch their parents' punishment as a warning of what awaited disobedience. These displays were carefully staged. The timing, the location, even the audience was chosen to maximize fear. The goal wasn't just to kill it, was to make the act unforgettable. And while the public spectacles were terrifying, what happened behind the closed gates of a castle was worse. There, the performances stopped, and the cruelty became more intimate and far more inventive. Not every act of cruelty made it into the chronicles. Some punishments were carried out in shadows, whispered about but never officially recorded. These were the torments no warlord wanted tied to his name, yet his men carried them out all the same. Inside the dim chambers of a castle's dungeon, prisoners might be suspended by their wrists until their shoulders tore from their sockets. Others were bound in tight bamboo cages, small enough that the victim couldn't stand, sit, or lie down comfortably. Days in such confinement broke the mind long before the body gave out. There are accounts of water torture, where captives were forced to kneel for hours while icy streams poured onto their foreheads, driving them toward madness. In colder months, prisoners were stripped and left exposed to winter winds until hypothermia claimed them. One particularly cruel practice involved keeping a prisoner alive after severe maiming, removing ears, noses, or fingers, then releasing them back to their own people as a living warning. These acts weren't about justice or honor. They were about dominance, about ensuring the enemy's spirit was shattered beyond repair. But the most unsettling truth: some of these methods weren't banned, they were simply erased from memory. Centuries later, the image of the samurai would be polished into something almost saintly: disciplined warriors of virtue, protectors of culture. But that image was no accident. It was manufactured. Warlords ordered chroniclers to omit certain battles from official records. Brutal sieges became victories of strategy. Tortures were recast as rituals or erased entirely. Heads displayed on castle gates, rebranded as ceremonial honors for the dead. When the West began taking an interest in Japan during the 19th century, this whitewashing only intensified. Victorian scholars preferred tales of refined tea ceremonies and elegant poetry, not accounts of boiling prisoners alive. Artworks were commissioned showing samurai as stoic heroes, never as grinning executioners. Even archaeology played its part. Human remains showing signs of torture were quietly catalogued as battle damage or funeral rites. Museums displayed the swords, armor, and banners, but never the implements of pain. The result: generations grew up believing in the myth of the noble warrior, while the victims' stories rotted in forgotten scrolls or were burned entirely. But the truth can't stay buried forever. And what happened in one particularly infamous execution scene rips that mask clean off and drags us into the darkest chapter of them all. It begins in the pale light of early morning. The mist clings low to the ground, curling around the legs of soldiers who stand in rigid silence. Somewhere beyond the fortress walls, a rooster crows, a sound absurdly out of place in what is about to happen. The prisoner is led forward. He is no nameless commoner. He is the enemy's warlord, captured after weeks of siege, dragged from a hidden chamber beneath the castle keep. His clothes are torn, his hair disheveled, but his eyes are still alive with defiance. He is brought to the center of the courtyard, where a low wooden platform waits. On it rests a lacquered box. The lid is opened with exaggerated ceremony, and inside, staring back at him, is the severed head of his most trusted general. Freshly cleaned, lips painted, eyes shut as though in peaceful sleep. The message is clear: your cause is gone. Your army is gone. Your world is gone. The victor steps forward, speaking in a tone that sounds almost polite. He offers the warlord a short dagger, its blade gleaming cold in the morning light. There will be no hanging, no crucifixion. Instead, he will end his life with honor, the deadliest insult in the samurai lexicon, for it forces the condemned to become his own executioner. The ritual begins. The warlord kneels on the tatami mat laid over the damp earth. Two attendants adjust his robes, exposing the pale flesh of his abdomen. The kaishakunin, the second, stands just behind and to the side, holding his sword at the ready. The crowd of high-ranking samurai watches, their faces unreadable. The warlord grips the dagger in both hands. He hesitates. In another time, another place, he might have done this willingly. Now, it is an act forced upon him, performed under the gaze of his enemies. He drives the blade into his stomach. The air leaves his lungs in a sharp gasp. Blood wells up instantly, staining his white robe. Slowly, deliberately, he drags the blade across his abdomen. The pain is unimaginable. His body convulses, his teeth grit. The kaishakunin does not strike immediately. The delay is intentional. This is the victor's final victory, to watch the light drain from the man's eyes before granting him release. Finally, when the warlord's strength begins to falter, the kaishakunin steps forward. One swift motion, and his head falls. It is caught in a basket lined with white silk, as though it were some rare and delicate artifact. The head will be cleaned, its hair smoothed, its face painted. By nightfall, it will join the others on display at the castle gate, staring blankly at passers-by, a silent warning to all who might dream of resistance. The platform is scrubbed, the blood is washed away, the tatami mat is burned. By the next day, the courtyard will look untouched. No sign of the ritual, no trace of the man who died here. But for those who witnessed it, the image will never fade. The morning mist, the painted head in the lacquered box, the dagger's slow arc through flesh, and the final, merciless cut. And for us, centuries later, the horror is doubled, not just in what was done, but in how carefully it was hidden. Centuries have passed since that morning in the courtyard. The heads have long turned to dust. The castle walls have been rebuilt, polished, and marketed as tourist attractions. The samurai are celebrated in films, novels, and museum exhibits, depicted as paragons of discipline, wisdom, and honor. But the truth, once seen, cannot be unseen. Beneath the lacquered armor and poetic codes was a system that could twist ritual into cruelty and turn honor into a weapon more devastating than any sword. We're told these acts were of their time, relics of a harsher age. That's the easy answer, the safe answer. But the reality is more uncomfortable. Cruelty wrapped in ceremony is not unique to the samurai. It is a pattern that repeats wherever power is unchecked, wherever institutions control the narrative and decide what the public is allowed to remember. Even now, governments, armies, and corporations craft their own myths, dressing brutality in the language of necessity, honor, or progress. The tools have changed, but the psychology remains the same. The victims are silenced. The perpetrators are immortalized, and the audience is invited to admire the spectacle without ever questioning the cost. The samurai were not just warriors. They were master storytellers, shaping their own legacy while burying their victims twice, once in the ground and once in history. Our task, in uncovering stories like this, is to resist that second burial, to refuse the polished version, to remember the blood beneath the lacquer. Because the past is not gone. It waits, quietly, patiently ready to be repeated by those who hope we've forgotten. You've just seen what polite history refuses to show, the rituals of terror, the crimes behind the code of honor. If you believe these truths deserve to be heard, don't let this be the last time. Subscribe now, hit the bell, and like this video so it reaches others who want the real history, not the sanitized version. Tell me in the comments, what shocked you the most? The public displays, the private tortures, or the fact it's all been buried? Next time, we'll go inside the dungeons of the Inquisition to uncover the secret tortures the Vatican still won't admit to.